Dear God, please set aside everything we think we know about ourselves, about our disease, about the big book, the 12 steps, the program, the fellowship, the people in the fellowship, and all spiritual terms, especially you, God, so that we may have an open mind and a new experience with all these things. Please help us see the truth. We surrender this next hour to you. Your will, not ours, be done. Amen. I'm very blessed to be the host of this meeting and podcast that is the Afro-Euro Timezones. I hope that you'll join us and draw strength and hope from these podcasts that we will host on Fridays at 8 a.m. UK time and 10 a.m. European and South African time. Reco12 is an organisation with the mission of learning and sharing the similarities of addiction of all kinds and gaining and sharing tools and hope from others who are walking in a similar path. We come together from all places, faiths and backgrounds to gain tools and hope from others. Speakers from our past meetings have represented many fellowships, addictions and afflictions, and we look forward to continuing to add to the diversity of speakers and backgrounds, and I hope you'll reach out if you think your experience, strength and hope will benefit this special community. Today's speaker is Loz, who'll be speaking for around 30 minutes, and we'll get him to share, and then followed by questions and answers afterwards. If you have any questions, please raise your hand after or put your question in the chat during the share, and we'll get to them afterwards. The Reco12 family of Reco resources continue to grow and have more and more resources for the addict and the loved ones of those addicted. We have some recorded shares and a couple of other super exciting projects, one of which is the Big Book Roundtable discussion, where we dive into the first 164 pages of the Big Book of Alcoholics Anonymous with a few recovered individuals, David G. and Nikki M. and Justin B., who are past speakers in Reco12 and who really try to know and live the Big Book. Tradition 7, it's the self-supporting service, and we appreciate your help in keeping us working our step 12 in this manner. We gratefully accept one-time contributions through PayPal, Venmo, and Wise through the links in the chat. We also offer a monthly subscription program called Reco12 Spearheads. To join in and help support these cool projects, please consider donating at www.reco12.com/support or click on the link in the chat of the live meeting. We look forward each meeting to growing deeper in effectiveness and understanding as we learn from and with our special speakers. Today, I'm very blessed to have Loz here, who continues to work through the spiritual world, continuing to thrive in his abundant grace and wisdom, trying to practice these principles in all his affairs. So it's with great pleasure, I'm going to hand over to you, Loz. Take it away, my love.
Thanks very much, Lisa. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. It's Loz, and I'm a recovered addict alcoholic, and I'm really grateful to have the opportunity to share my experience, strength, and hope. And Lisa was just reading out what I'd sent throughout. I was thinking, my first thought was, that's a bit of a tall order to live up to. And I'm only human and I do make mistakes and I'm not perfect, but by the grace of God, you know, I've been saved. I was going to say prayer, and I usually say set aside prayer, but because that's already been shared on the meeting, I'm just going to, straight to step 3 prayer, and it's a prayer, obviously not, it's in relation to the step 3 prayer, which is originally in the Big Book of Alcoholics Anonymous, but this time when I went through, continue to go through with a new sponsor, my very dear friend and sponsor asked me to reframe that and rewrite it in my own words. So I'm just going to read that just to try and ground myself. So it goes, so this is what I wrote and this is how I try and practice and live today. So dear God, I come before you today. I turn my will to you. I seek abundance of turning myself over. Please take my difficulties. Allow me to see your grace, your love. I ask that you show me your will and your guidance today and forever. Turn my thinking into your wisdom, your power and your way, so I may better always do your way. I abandon myself and my past and ask you to have all of me. So yeah, thanks very much for asking me to come along. I'm just going to read something out of We Agnostics, because I was on a meeting last night with my sponsor, and someone was sharing on this paragraph, and it really resonated with me. So it's on page 44, and it's the second paragraph from We Agnostics. And obviously, We Agnostics, I didn't really understand what We Agnostics was, and a whole chapter gives me an opportunity to ponder the notion of God and We Agnostics. The definition of We Agnostics is, without knowledge. I didn't have any knowledge when I first came in, and I'll go into that in a minute. Just read the paragraph, and it's on page 44, it's the second paragraph down. So, to one who feels he is an atheist or agnostic, such an experience seems impossible, but to continue as he is means disaster, especially if he is an alcoholic of the hopeless variety. To be doomed to an alcoholic death or to live on a spiritual basis are not always easy alternatives to face. Just to qualify myself a little bit, before I came into recovery, I thought I was going to forever remain an addict. I thought I was going to still be taking drugs and alcohol and acting out with my behaviour until I was dead. And I'd come to accept that, I was going to be doomed an alcoholic or addicted death, and drugs and alcohol were going to kill me. And I've always, in relation to spirituality and God consciousness and the sixth sense it talks about in the big book further down in steps 10 and 11, I've always believed, but I've never really had the ability to nurture and develop and understand and expand on that stuff. And so I'm really grateful. And I guess, a bit of qualification for the purposes of identification for anyone who's listening to this at a later stage. And what defines me as an addict and an alcoholic of a hopeless variety, the reality is I have an illness that is sitting in my mind, and when I put one in me, I can't stop. I set off this allergy and phenomenon of craving, and I don't know whether I'm going to come back. And my experience of when I was younger, and doesn't define me for being an addict or an alcoholic. Yes, my experience was painful and uncomfortable, but it doesn't define me and make me the reason why I'm an addict and an alcoholic. Just because I was adopted and rejected and abandoned at birth and then brought up by a family and then told when I was 10 that they weren't my parents and that I rebelled and acted out of pain and hurt and turmoil doesn't define me as why I took drinking drugs. I essentially took drinking drugs because I liked the effect it gave me. That ease and comfort of putting that first one in me, whatever that first one was. It doesn't define me that, I'm an addict and I'm an alcoholic because, when my mum went away to India, I was abused by the person who looked after me. That's not the reason what makes me an addict or an alcoholic. The reason that makes me an addict and an alcoholic was, when I first came into recovery, I had the opportunity to identify. I knew I had a problem. And apologies if I skate around a little bit. I knew I had a problem, and I knew that I liked to act out on drinking drugs, and I knew that I liked to take copious amounts and just to get off my head. And so when I first, girls' institutions and death is part of my story, and my addiction and my alcoholism took me to institutions, psychiatric wards. And my first experience of that was, again, for the purposes of identification and purposes of identification with anyone who's coming in and is listening to this, you know, my first experience of being put in a detention centre was when I was 14 years old. And I now understand that that was supposed to give me a short, sharp shock, but actually what it allowed me to do was, you know, learn how to get away and be dishonest even more and associate with, you know, criminals and people who were, you know, in the same mindset as I was. So all of that doesn't define me why I'm an addict or an alcoholic. Reality is, you know, like I said, you know, as I've diagnosed myself from going through the doctor's opinion, you know, I like the effect, I like the ease and comfort. You know, when I don't take drink and drugs, I'm restless, irritable and discontented. Unless at once I experience a spiritual experience, which, how do I do that? Through working through the 12 steps of recovery and developing and growing, which I'll come to shortly. So none of that defines me why I did what I did. You know, I did it because, you know, I have.
Got questions about addiction, recovery, or just life in general? Let's noodle it out together. Grab your big book, a pen, a highlighter, and a notepad, and join Nikki M and me, Justin B, on Reco12 Noodle It Out with Nikki M. Each episode, we take real-life questions, ours, yours, and those from the recovery community, and dig deep into the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous to find real, practical solutions. So, if you're ready to do the work and apply the solution, tune in to Noodle It Out with Nikki M, streaming now on your favorite podcast platform.
Like I said, I'm having illness. So, you know, like I said too, you know, this isn't my first rodeo, you know. Relapse is part of my story, and I'm also aware that, you know, it doesn't have to be part of your story, and it doesn't need to be part of your story, but the simple diagnosis of the reason why I relapsed was I wasn't working the spiritual program, I wasn't practicing these principles. And what are the principles? The daily living in the steps, the prayer, the meditation. I took my foot off the gas and I retracted backwards through the steps. Then I became, you know, as I said, because I wasn't enlarging on my spiritual way of life, you know, I became restless, irritable, discontented again. And it was all your fault. I wouldn't take responsibility for any of my actions. Woe is me, you know, that sort of mentality. Living in page 62, selfish, self-centered, self-seeking, driven by 100 forms of fear. You know, I wasn't making that decision to turn my will and my life over to God, as I understood God. I wasn't, you know, continuing to work as a child of God, with a new employer, being all powerful. That one is God, you know. And I wasn't doing that. And as a direct result, you know, that mental obsession that he talks about up in the preceding chapters up until, you know, he talks about step 1, up until chapter 4, we agnostics. So that mental obsession came back, and, you know, I was 8.5 years in sobriety. And, you know, I've done very well for myself. You know, I created, you know, a lovely outlook, and on the business, I was very successful. And I created my higher power. I reformed my higher power into money. And as a direct result of that, you know, I went backwards, and that mental obsession came back on me. And that blank spot that he talks about in the book, you know, I convinced myself that, you know, I'm not really an alcoholic. And this time it will be different. I can have one. And I remember coming home to my now ex-wife and saying to her, after being on a high prestige, you know, 3-day relocation, saying to her, I could really do with a drink. And she said, why don't you have one? And I said, okay. And that was it. loss of my 8.5 years, loss of my business, loss of my house, loss of my wife, and my behaviour got erratic. And, I would act out and I would create arguments and I would go off and get off my head and do what I want. And as a direct result of that, I lost everything and nearly lost myself. And I wasn't aware, as a direct result of picking up that first drink, the psychosis that I was going to experience, B, the impact on my mental health, my mind, and the despair and the turmoil and the regret and the remorse and the guilt and the shame of my behaviour and the way I created and harmed others. And I'm sharing this, again, for the purposes of identification. My life is nothing like that today. And I'll come to that shortly. And by the grace of God, I had divine intervention. God did for me what I could not do for myself again, and gave me another chance. And I'm one of these people that to get clean and sober, I have to go into a setting which is out of the community. I respect people who can get clean in the community. Personally, I can't. And I went through a detox, and I made that mistake again. I relapsed again after 12 years, basically, and I did the same again. And this time, I reverted back to old lives, and I thought it'd be a really good idea. My best thinking. I thought it'd be a really good idea, to maintain my cocaine addiction and alcohol addiction or ism. That I would buy a load of drugs and start selling drugs again, because that would be a quick fix to make money. And as a direct result of that, I got caught. And I'm really grateful for this experience because I haven't bought since. And God has truly done for me what I couldn't do for myself, and has really allowed me to reevaluate, reset, and remodel my life in a spiritual way through the process of this beautiful big book of Alcoholics Anonymous. And to the best of my ability, I really try and practice these principles in all my affairs. Like I said, I'm a human being. I'm not perfect. I do make mistakes. However, I have a solution, a program to fall back into. And I have some really beautiful, kind, loving, thoughtful, compassionate gentlemen in my life that I'm accountable to, and I'm held accountable. And so, like I said, going back to my last debacle, which I'm really grateful for, which I wasn't at the time. I got caught with, a considerable amount of drugs, and I got a prison sentence. And, by this time, I've been out of prison or any institution apart from a detox, for any, incarceration prison for 17 years. And I found myself back in the prison. And I can honestly say, hand on my heart, it's the best thing that ever happened to me. Call it a God shot. The only thing that I managed to find whilst I was in prison, unfortunately, there was no means at the time. And the only thing that I managed to find, by the grace of God, was a big book. I had some knowledge of what I needed to do, and being in prison, I was aware that I had two choices. I either get involved with the shenanigans of, drinking hooch and taking drugs and blah, 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 and acting out and, etc. Or reevaluate and reset. And like I said, God did for me what I couldn't do for myself. And I started to read the book, I started to pray, I started to sit in quietness, I started to sit in stillness, I started to journal, I started to write, I started to communicate with God again and ask for guidance and support and love and tolerance and acceptance. And, well, you know, I knew that I had
Hey, Spearheads, if you're looking to dive deeper into the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous with people who live the solution, then you won't want to miss Reco12 Big Book Roundtable. Join David G., Nikki M., and me, the moderator Justin B., 3 recovered addicts from multiple fellowships, as we break down the big book line by line. In each 30-minute episode, we share our experience, strength, and hope in a real, raw, and practical roundtable discussion. So, if you are ready to learn and apply what you learn, tune in to Reco12 Big Book Roundtable on your favorite podcast platform. Hey Reco12 Spearheads, if our recovery resources have helped you, please consider a donation. Your financial support, as well as your word-of-mouth support, keeps Reco12 running and reaching the man who is still sick. Donate today at reco12.com/support or check the show notes for PayPal and Venmo links. Every contribution helps carry the message. Thanks for being a Reco12 Spearhead.